rounding to whole numbers with adamonlinetutoring. Here are the beginner questions, some of the easiest questions that you're likely to find on this topic. Numbers are sometimes approximated or rounded to make them easier to work with. Numbers can be rounded to different amounts, such as the nearest whole number, the nearest 10, the nearest 100, and the nearest 1000. For the first question, we're rounding 37.8 to the nearest whole number. Rounding to the nearest whole number can also be described as rounding to the nearest unit and also to the nearest integer, and slightly less common, to the nearest 1. When thinking about place value, our units column is this one to the left hand side of the decimal point. That means our rounding line needs to go after this column. Next, you need to look at the number in the column to the right hand side of the rounding line, and you need to decide if this number is 5 or more. In this case it is, so we will need to round up, and we will need to add 1 to the number in the units column. When rounded, everything after the rounding line changes to a 0, so the answer is 38.0, which can be written as 38 without the point 0. On to the next question. I'm rounding 485 to the nearest 10. When thinking about our place value, we have our units, tens, and hundreds columns. We need to put our rounding line after the tens column. Looking at the number to the right hand side, we can make a decision on whether this is 5 or more. In this case it is 5, so again we round up, meaning we need to add 1 to the tens column, and everything after the line will turn to 0, so 490. Next, 317 is being rounded to the nearest 100. Units, tens, hundreds. My rounding line will go after the hundreds column. Looking at the number to the right hand side of this and deciding whether it's 5 or more, which in this case it's not, so we need to round this number down. A common mistake is to think that when we round up we add 1 to the number, so therefore rounding down we would need to subtract 1, but that's not the case when rounding down. The number will stay the same, but everything after the line will still turn to zeros, so the answer is 300. Lastly, we're rounding 9,058 to the nearest 1000. Units, tens, hundreds, thousands. My line needs to go after the thousands column, looking at the number to the right hand side and whether this is 5 or more. It isn't, so the 9 will stay the same and everything after the line will turn to 0, giving me 9,000. On to the intermediate questions with a slight increase in difficulty, rounding 39.81 to the nearest whole number. My rounding line will go after the whole number column, which is the units column. Looking at the number to the right hand side, which is 5 or more, means I will need to add 1 to the number before the line. In this case, you can see that that turns 9 into 10, so I'll need to put the 0 down, and I'll need to carry 1 10 into the tens column, meaning the 3 will turn to 4. Everything after the line will change to 0, and this can be written down as 40, rounding 678 to the nearest 10, placing my line after the tens column. The next number is 5 or more, so this will round up to 680, rounding 2,345 to the nearest 100. My rounding line goes after the 3 in the hundreds column. Looking at the next number to the right hand side, this is not 5 or more, so we will round down to give me 2,300. Lastly, we're rounding 12 to the nearest 1000. We can see the units column, the tens column, but we can't see the hundreds and thousands, so let's put those in and put some placeholders. My rounding line needs to go after the thousands column, which is this one. Looking at the next number, which is less than 5, means I'll need to round down. The number in the thousands column will stay the same, and everything after the line will turn to zeros, which means that my final answer can be written as 0. On to the advanced questions, some of the trickiest questions that you're likely to find on this topic. At its closest, Jupiter is 390,682,810 miles from Earth. We need to write this distance to the nearest million miles. So writing the number down along with their place value, units, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, and hundreds of millions. Since we're rounding to the nearest million miles, I can put my rounding line after the millions column. Look at the number to the right and decide whether this is 5 or more, which it is. So this will add 1 to the millions column, and everything after the line will change to zeros. So the answer is 391 million. The number of sweets in a jar is 670 to the nearest 10. What's the maximum possible number of sweets and the minimum possible number of sweets in the jar? So if 670 has been rounded to the nearest 10, that would mean that my rounding line was after the tens column. So I need to think about what numbers could be in the units column, which would be the maximum number when rounded down, which would have to be 674. Because if I had 675, this would then round up to give me 680 to the nearest 10. When thinking about the numbers that would have rounded up to give me 670, they would have come from having 6 in the tens column. So 660, and anything that's 5 or more would round up, so 665. Lastly, Adam keeps 1,600 chickens rounded to the nearest 100. What's the maximum number of chickens Adam could have? Rounded to the nearest 100, my rounding line would go after the 6 in the hundreds column. And using something similar to what we did above, for this to be rounded down, we would need the next number to be less than 5. So the maximum could be 4. And since we want the largest number in our units column, we will want to put the largest number possible, which would be 9. So 1,649. Here's some questions I've completed. It appears as though I've made some mistakes. See if you can pause the video and tell me what they are, or write some corrections in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you found that video useful, don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment. If you're struggling with topics or finding maths difficult, subscribe and turn on notifications to receive regular updates about new video tutorials and other useful content. You can visit and follow all of my socials by clicking the links in the description below.